I like to often tee up my remarks by providing a metaphor or word picture that I think really captures this issue and why it's important to agriculture. I think agriculture can be adequately or correctly described as trying to attach a garden hose to a fire hydrant. Attaching a garden hose to a fire hydrant. The good news with agriculture is that we have increased production that's occurring, and that not only is attributed to the technology that's being provided to farmers, but I think even more importantly, the productivity of the American farmer continues to be on the increase, and so supply has been fomented, it's been generated. The other good news is that we have this demand, both domestic but even more consequential internationally. And with witnessing the largest migration of people from poverty to the middle class and what the ramifications of that has on the diets of these people, particularly in places like China and other Asian countries, demand is on the increase as well. And so there's this wonderful story to tell with agriculture right now, but the concern that we have is supply. Profitability is not just a function of supply, and it's not just a function of demand. You have to have connectivity between supply and demand. And so I think therefore it can be adequately expressed that we in agriculture are trying to attach a garden hose to a fire hydrant. We have this increased production, we have this increased demand, but we have this transportation system that I contend and others contend is ill-equipped to handle what you and other farmers are producing. I use this slide a lot when I give a presentation because I refer to it as my bottom line slide. And this is a soybean statistic, but you can substitute a lot of other commodities for soybeans. You can insert corn for it. You can insert beef. You can insert poultry. The story is quite similar. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, on a quarterly basis, they compare and contrast the cost of not only growing in this case, a metric ton of soybeans from a number of locations in the United States. But they also compare the cost of transporting those soybeans. And they use a number of origination points in the United States. And I listed a couple of them. One, a barge delivery, a barge movement origination point, Davenport, Iowa. And then also a rail origination point, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And moving that metric ton of soybeans to a customer in Shanghai, China, and they juxtapose that to the cost of moving a metric ton of soybeans from North Mato Grosso, Brazil. And for those of you who know something about Brazilian agriculture, Mato Grosso is the number one soybean producing region of Brazil. What I think is interesting is that Davenport to Shanghai, that's going to be a barge movement down to southern Louisiana ports, and then it's going to in turn be loaded onto a vessel going through the Panama Canal onto China. But from Davenport down to southern Louisiana, that's about a 900 to a 950 mile journey. Sioux Falls to Shanghai, that's going to be a rail movement from Sioux Falls to the Pacific Northwest, loaded onto an ocean vessel onto China. That's about a 1,400 to 1,500 mile journey. North Mato Grosso, that's going to be about a 900 to 950 mile journey to the port regions where most agricultural exports are launched. And so the actual, from a mileage perspective, it's either comparable, U.S. versus Brazil, or even longer in the case of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And this is going to be similar if you're looking at rail originations in western Missouri, for example. But as you can see highlighted in red, that's the cost of moving that metric ton of soybeans to that customer. Farm value, that incorporates the cost of production. Usually, Brazil is a little bit cheaper than the U.S. In this case, Brazil is a little bit more expensive, and this is from the third quarter of last year. But what this slide clearly expresses is that the reason the U.S. for soybeans, but this is also applicable to other agricultural commodities, the reason why we are the most economical choice on the international marketplace is not due to a lower cost of production, it's due to a lower cost of transportation. And we in this country often talk about outcompeting the rest of the world, the competitiveness agenda, doubling exports over these next few years. And often the conversation that will ensue from that will often be kind of trying to talk about innovating the rest of the world. We need to be more innovative. We need to out-innovate other countries. And I can certainly understand that that's very reasonable to talk about that. But sometimes out-competing the rest of the world is not just a function of out-innovating. Sometimes it's a function of out-delivering, out-executing. It's taking a product that is grown in the United States and a product that's grown similarly in other countries, in the soybeans case, South America, and it's just being able to get that product to those customers better. And that's what we've been doing. That's the secret to our success right now with agriculture. Yes, we believe that we grow the best soybeans in the world, but South American soybeans are of high quality as well. But what really sets us apart is our ability to get that product to our customers in a cost-effective, predictable, safe manner. And what concerns me is that while our South American competitors are being aggressive in investing in their infrastructure, we remain anemic in investing in ours. So you don't have to be much of a prophet to envision a future where we're no longer the most economical choice. And I like to say a lot of times, we unfortunately are a spending nation. We're not an investing nation, and there's a big difference between the two. And there was a time, years ago, where we had more of an investment mentality, particularly with transportation. And I think one of the things that we in agriculture can really provide a great service to our broader economy, not only just to our industry, but to the broader economy, trying to recapture that investment mentality instead of just this spending mentality that pervades everything that we do in this country. So because of the importance of this issue, a number of years ago, a number of state soybean associations gathered together along with the two national soybean groups, the American Soybean Association, which is the policy government affairs arm for soybean farmers, and then the United Soybean Board, which is the national checkoff organization. Those two organizations, along with 11 states now, we originally started with 7, now we're up to 11, decided to create an organization focused exclusively on the transportation system that serves agriculture. My office is located in the Iowa Soybean Association building, but I'm governed by a board of directors from farmers from all of these different sponsoring entities. So we are a farmer-funded and farmer-led organization. I like to describe agriculture as having the most diverse and elongated supply chain of any industry. You'd be hard-pressed to find an industry that really is heavily invested in every single mode of transportation, with the exception of air travel, in existence. We heavily rely on these primitive farm-to-market roads that you guys rely on, to highways and interstates, to the inland waterway system, to freight rail, to ports, to the post-Panamax, large ocean vessels that are crisscrossing our oceans. And so because our logistics chain really needs to be looked at as a chain, you can't just emphasize certain links in that chain and de-emphasize others. Each link is important. You're only as strong as your weakest link. So as a result, we do devote a lot of time and attention to all of the modes that the soybean industry and agriculture relies on, one of which is our lock and dam system. This is an issue, I'm sure many of you in this room can attest to this, and you probably have battle scars to show for it. This is an issue where there's an extreme amount of frustration, but there's a real low degree of optimism. This is an issue that we in agriculture and freight interests broadly have been lobbying for and advocating for years and years and years, and there's just been so little success. And this isn't flattering to the issue, but I think it's very true. When I think about the lock and dam issue, I'm reminded of the old adage that's attributed to Albert Einstein, that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And I think that's very true when it comes to locks and dams. We've been fighting this fight, but yet there's just been such a lack of progress to report. And I tell my board of directors that when we meet about this issue in the future and we discuss this issue, locks and dams, I don't want it to be Groundhog Day. I don't want our discussion tomorrow to be an exact replica of our discussion today. I want it to be different. I want to try to do what we can to try to stimulate some new and innovative thinking. And so what we did is we released last month a white paper, an analysis that was conducted by an organization called the Texas Transportation Institute out of Texas A&M University. They're one of the preeminent research institutions on inland waterway issues. And the charge that I presented them was to look at two arguments or two statements, either validate them or invalidate them. And argument number one that we're suggesting is that how we allocate money is just as important as how much money we allocate. Given how scarce resources are at the federal, state, and local level, our argument cannot simply be the government needs to write a bigger check. Government, you need to spend more money. That's not really aligning ourselves with reality, I think. I mean, we would be the first to suggest that, going back to my earlier statement, we're a spending nation, not an investing nation. We believe that we need to invest more in our infrastructure. But if that simply is the sum total of our argument, government, write a bigger check, I don't think that's going to get us very far. So we need to be open to other alternatives. And so one of the things that we did with this research is we looked at how we build and construct new locks in this country and how other countries do it. And we profiled two foreign examples. One is the Panama Canal expansion, and that's for those of you who don't know, that's a $5.25 billion project, started in 2007, will be completed in 2015. It is exponentially more complex, has more moving parts than anything that we have going on in our inland waterway system. But yet, this is a project that is on time and relatively within budget, give or take 5 to 6 months, which is an incredible track record given the scale of that project. We also look at a project called the Dergonk Lock, and that's at the port of Antwerp in Belgium. Once that's completed, it's about a $450 million project. Once completed, it'll be the largest lock in the world, about 1,640 feet long, even larger than the Panama Canal, the new expanded locks at the Panama Canal. But what we see is these are projects in other countries that are on budget and on schedule. And then we contrast that with our track record in this country. The Olmsted Lock and Dam, that is the most flagrant example of a cost overrun that we have with our lock and dam efforts. This had an original price tag of $775 million, and the most recent cost revision is $3.1 billion. That is a 400% cost overrun. But even a cost overrun that's more modest, that we almost brag about in our federal government, McAlpin Lock and Dam, and that's on the Ohio River by Louisville, that had a 38% cost overrun and 6.5 years added to the project. And so, but we look at this, we examine this issue, and we ask the question, well, why? Why do these other countries have such better project delivery than we do in this country? Is it because they have engineers working on their projects and we have Larry, Moe, and Curly working on our projects? I mean, we have credentialed, educated engineers working on these projects, and so the answer to that question is no. So what really screams out at you when you examine this is the reason why they have such more optimal project delivery than what we do is because they provide their funding in either a lump sum or in predictable increments. So the Panama Canal Authority, for example, they know that they've got the funding. They've secured the funding up front. Novel concept. And so they can then tell their contractors and subcontractors and subcontractors, et cetera, you can go forth and secure all of the steel you need, all of the concrete you need, the labor force, the equipment, the dredging equipment, everything that you need to do. The money is there, go forth and conquer. In this country, we do something quite different. We, say if it's a $500 million project, and ideally you would provide $50 million a year over 10 years. In this country, that's subordinate to the annual appropriations process, and you kind of know how that ends up working out for everyone. So if you want to have $50 million in year one, you might just get $25 million, just because it's subordinate to the acrimony that's going on in Washington, D.C. And then in year two, you're hoping that if you're the Army Corps of Engineers, you're hoping that you get the $50 million that you were promised in year two, plus the $25 you did not get in year one. But Congress is operating under a continuing resolution, so funding streams have been frozen at prior year levels, and so you just get $25 million. And then in year three, you're seeing that Congress is not having their appropriation bills done by their deadline. There might not be any money for that in year three. So as a result, what happens is that work will start, and then work will stop, and then work will start again, and then work will stop. And I had the opportunity last year to testify at a congressional hearing about this issue, and I told the members, I said, this may be a strong statement, but I think it's true, that if I were to design a system, a funding system that would result in guaranteed cost overruns, I would design the system we have. Our cost overruns, they're not an unintended consequence. They are a predictable outcome. And until we get a better handle on how you allocate money is just as important as how much money you allocate, we will continue to have these major cost overruns, and we will continue to practice poor stewardship of taxpayer dollars. The argument number one is about how you allocate funding. Number two is a predictably good inland waterway system is better than a hypothetically great one. And this is very controversial. We wrestle with this issue because it would be in the best interest of the U.S. soybean farmer, particularly in this part of the country, to have brand new locks and dams with auxiliary chambers, deeper channels. I would love to show you my wish list. It's pretty expansive. But the question that we have, what concerns me is that we are failing to build these new locks, and at the same time we are failing to maintain the system that we have, so the net result is the overall system continues to degrade and becomes less useful. And that is a discouragement for the grain handlers in this country to invest in barge loading facilities. And what we kind of come to is we start from the assumption that the pool of resources available for locks and dams, it's our belief, and our crystal ball isn't perfect, but this is what our crystal ball is saying, that the funding for locks and dams will either be stagnant or on the decline. And if that's the case, we believe that the optimal use of those scarce resources to first take care of what you have and then try to acquire what you do not have. You don't inverse them. We think that's a poor utilization of scarce taxpayer dollars. Now, if their assumption is the federal government's going to be flush with money next year, then I would like brand new locks. That's a logical extension of that conclusion, but our conclusion is the federal treasury is not going to be flush with new money anytime soon. And I've never heard a real rational argument for why people believe that the federal government is going to have more money in the future. The federal government wins the lottery? I don't know what it is. Every message that I'm receiving from Washington is that funding will be stagnant or on the decline. And so we ask the question, should we transition from what we describe a build and expand approach to a preserve and maintain approach? Given the fact that one lock construction project, $376 million, is equal to a cost of 9 major rehab projects. Again, if funding is going to be stagnant or on the decline, what is the optimal utilization of those scarce taxpayer dollars? And our suggestion is agriculture would be better served if we transition to that kind of approach. It's very controversial. People have said to me, is that a capitulation? Is that waving the white flag? And those were the nice things that people said. But we think, given how the lack of progress we've made on this issue, we think it's time for some fresh thinking. If there's an issue that demands some fresh thinking, we think it's this one. We believe that the issue is so important because the Panama Canal expansion does have the potential of making barge more relevant and more utilized. And so the last thing we would want is all of a sudden we have the capacity, we have the demand to move via barge, but all of a sudden our locks and dams continue to degrade and are less useful. We did some research that showed after the Panama Canal expands in 2015 that grain and oil seeds transiting the canal could increase by 30% by the year 2020, 2021. For soybeans, each vessel down in southern Louisiana, 58% of soybean exports leave from southern Louisiana grain and oilseed terminals. So that's by far our number one port region in this country. You could add an additional 500,000 bushels per vessel with the Panama Canal expansion. Given the price that $6, $7, $8 million is just an additional value per vessel. And then you could increase the average draw area to the river by 91 miles. And this map really illustrates that. It shows that currently you have about a 70-mile draw area on either side of the river. If you're 70 miles or closer to the river, there's really a strong reason to ship via barge. If you're outside that, rail is really the most economical option for you. But with the Panama Canal expansion and the greater efficiencies of shipping out of southern Louisiana ports, that's going to make the feeder modes into that system more economical. And so what you could see is more and more areas of the country all of a sudden regarding barge transportation as more viable. And so given how important it is, we think it's the optimal time to make sure we're taking good care of our lock and dam system and practicing good stewardship of it. We're also very concerned about trucking. I use the statistic: freight demand by all modes will increase by 75% by the year 2035. That's what the U.S. DOT says. But yet, demand for trucking will increase 77%. But despite that, the miles of public roadways have only increased 4.5% since 1980. So you have this increased demand, but yet you're being constricted by supply. Not only from the miles of public roadways, it's not keeping pace, but also something that's very concerning is this persistent driver shortage for trucking. You ask almost any trucking executive, and they talk about this persistent inability to acquire, drivers for their semis. And so even in the last few years when we have 8+% unemployment, that remains a problem. And so if you're having this this demand going up and supply being constricted both on the miles of public roadways, but also on the number of drivers, you start to have to ask the question, how can you increase capacity of your trucking sector if you're not just paving new roads? And one of the things that we're advocating for is for an increase in semi weight limits for our federal roads from 80,000 pounds to 97,000 pounds, provided that there's a sixth axle underneath that semi. A lot of states will have heavier weight limits for the state roads, but that can only be so effective given the fact that there's usually the delivery from farm to the original delivery point will often cross a U.S. highway or an interstate. And so there's only so much efficiency gain you can have just by relying on more generous or more liberal state regulations. So we would like to see an increase in federal semi-weight limits. And the research that we really emphasized before we talked about how soybean farmers could benefit, we first really wanted to adequately answer the question, will this endanger motorists? Because if you can't adequately address that question, you might as well not even proceed to talking about how you stand to benefit economically, because the general public will not be with you. And also we look at infrastructure wear and tear. And one of the things that our study clearly expressed is that motorist safety is more of a function of the density of semi-traffic and less a function of the weight of the individual semis. Okay? A safer system are semis where there's fewer semis, even though those semis are loaded heavier than a system in which you have more lightly loaded semis, but a number of them. And so motor safety is much more strongly correlated with density of semi-traffic and less correlated with the weight of the individual semis. And so you can be on the side of increased semi-weight limits and on the side of motorist safety, we believe. But this issue was visited last year during the House Transportation Infrastructure markup of the Surface Transportation Bill. That did not pass out of subcommittee, and so there's an opportunity to really educate the broader public and lawmakers about this subject before the next Surface Transportation Bill expires next year. Continuing on, rural infrastructure is something that's of grave concern to us as well, and we argue that it's probably the mode that's the most ignored, the least attended to. I describe, one of my idioms that I use is that agriculture is a 21st century industry utilizing an early 20th century rural infrastructure. We're getting ready to release some analysis that really shows this incompatibility between what modern agriculture needs and what rural infrastructure is able to provide. And we talk about when these rural roads and bridges were designed and created in the early 20th century, rural America was vastly different than it is today. From the number of farms to the production on those farms to the machinery that's utilized on those farms, the volume of production, where the production goes. And so what we do is we show that incompatibility and we talk about, okay, what's the funding gap? What kind of money will it take to upgrade this rural infrastructure for modern agriculture's needs? And what how could you bridge that funding gap? And then, if you don't, unless you want to tax your farmers into oblivion, there's really not going to be the money available to upgrade all these rural roads and bridges to suitable condition. And so what kind of outside the box thinking do we need to kind of stimulate? And so that's I think that's an issue that receives very little attention. And again, we would be among the most at the front of the line arguing for greater investment in our rural infrastructure. But we also think that if you just rely on more money, I don't think that's not a winning strategy to me. And so always also asking, how can you get more out of the system? How can you practice better stewardship of what you have? And that's going to be one of the themes of this analysis. We have a project underway in which, in alignment with that theme, in which we are engaging 11 state departments of transportation, in which we are offering to them that to help them acquire technology that can be used to evaluate the condition of their bridges. I was very surprised a couple weeks ago when the president, in his State of the Union address, talked about, he didn't just mention the word transportation, which often doesn't happen in a State of the Union address. He mentioned the term structurally deficient bridges, 70,000 structurally deficient bridges in this country. And while we have a very acute bridge problem in this country, one of the things that we've learned is that the process by which those bridges are evaluated, there's often a lot of subjectivity and variability to it. And there are a number of states on a very limited basis that are utilizing technology to assist the engineers in making a really precise rating of that bridge. Our concern is if you are unnecessarily load posting bridges, that means a farmer can incur a significant detour. What would normally be a 5-mile journey could be a 25-mile journey. And then number two is if you're overly conservative and you're rating this big number of bridges as structurally deficient, what happens is then you're allocating scarce resources to this larger number. And we believe that this is the time for those scarce taxpayer dollars to really be focused on those bridges that really do need to have attention. And so what we're doing with these state DOTs is we're telling them, look, instead of just shaking our fist at you and asking, why aren't you doing a better job of maintaining our bridges? We're saying, we're willing to put our money where our mouth is and say, we will help you, state DOT. We would like to enter into a collaboration with you in which we help underwrite the cost of you acquiring that equipment so that the end result is you have a better understanding of the true condition of your bridge inventory. And for an organization that's funded by and led by farmers who are known for good stewardship, I think that's a good message for us to convey to state DOTs and actually try to promote some solutions to this problem. Last slide, we're very much focused on trying to find ways to stimulate greater investment in our rail infrastructure. You're seeing more and more production for soybeans shifting to further western states, and really the main option for them is to rail to the west coast and then on to China. And one of the things that we're concerned with is that there's this need for agriculture going into the future, and the rail industry is only committed to a certain amount of funding, and there's this gap that exists. And so what a study that we're going to be releasing next month talks about ways to help address or ameliorate that funding gap. We want rural America to be an attractive place for investment by the rail sector, and this is this study really aspires to shed light on opportunities to do so. So with that, I will conclude my remarks. If there's any questions that you may have, I'd be happy to entertain those at this time. Yes, sir. Oh.
I was interested in your remarks about the cost overrun, especially of the Olmsted Dam on the Ohio River. This has, part of their problem has been allocation, like you mentioned. Are you aware of the type of construction that is being tried on that project and its failure?
Yeah, and that's a very welcome point. Yeah, the inappropriate way we allocate money to Olmsted is a significant contributing factor. It's not the only one. And what you're citing is, when Olmsted Lock and Dam, and this is close to the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi River by Cairo, Illinois, and it's a replacement for locks 52 and 53. And at the time, the Army Corps of Engineers said, we have this new way that we aspire to do this project, and it's called in the wet technology. Traditionally, if you're going to build a project like this, you erect a cofferdam and then you do it in the dry. You do any of that pouring and that needs to happen in the dry. And they felt that they had this new innovative approach called in the wet that was going to really be more effective, and that has not proven to be the case by a long shot. So, absolutely, there's things like that that really are a major contributor to these cost overruns. But, again, one of the major contributing factors is this way that we allocate money in the first place. There needs to be better stewardship, applied to how the appropriation occurs. Thanks for your comment, though.
Well, by the Corps' own figures, they could still revert to the cofferdam construction and save, I forget, at least $100 million.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure. How can we go about getting them to be more accountable with our tax dollars?
If you have the answer to that question, I encourage you to run for the U.S. Senate, and I'll vote for it. Well, I'll move to Missouri, and I'll vote for you. You're absolutely right, and this is what's sobering. This $3.1 billion. They've spent up heretofore about $1 billion, so they still have about $2 billion left to go. And just imagine if the Army Corps of Engineers came to us and said, and let's say none of what's happened in the past had happened, and they're starting from scratch, and they said, we've got a project, we have a plan to replace locks 52 and 53 on the Ohio River, and it's going to cost $2 billion. We would not accept that offer, okay? But yet they continue just to move along at this glacial pace of progress, and so absolutely there needs to be some more discipline imposed on them, more greater accountability, certainly, but there's no easy elixir to that one. One more question? In the back.
On the trucking issue, you said that there's a shortage of drivers, and there's beginning to be more and more of a shortage of drivers. But how do you figure on going about filling these when DOT and everybody else is starting to put regulations in place on all of us now? They now are trying to implement that all of us, whether we're in agriculture or not, are going to have to start keeping records on trucks that don't run but maybe 2 months out of the year. I mean, it's going to become a nightmare.
Yeah, and thanks for mentioning that. And that is an effort that needs to occur and be augmented on the federal level and also on a state level. I've visited with Garrett, Hawkins from Missouri Farm Bureau, and I know he's been very well versed and active, and this organization's been very active on a state level on this issue. So certainly there's some progress to be made on that. What we're suggesting is there are still opportunities to increase the capacity of the system that we have responsibly, that doesn't incur greater damage to the roads themselves, and it doesn't incur any additional danger. And so I think we have to be open for ways to increase capacity, given the fact that we have these major headwinds facing this sector. If you can't make the initial delivery from farm to the processor or the elevator, all of these subsequent issues, locks and dams and rail, they really fade in importance, because this is the initial delivery that makes it all happen. Thank you very much.